Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Future of Medicine podcast. I am your host, Dr. Wenzel. I am joined, as always, by the lovely and talented Jen Justice.
Hello.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good.
Good.
Always great to take time and sit down with you to create this content.
Same.
These discussions, always, they happen in the background all the time, every day. It's always great to formalize many of our thoughts and be able to document this in a way where we can just have a conversation. This episode, interestingly, we talk a lot about metabolic syndrome. In 70-80% of our episodes, we're referencing it. When I looked back through our content that we've created, it's been quite some time that we had an episode committed to just metabolic syndrome. So I thought this would be a great time to layer in another specific discussion. And this is about, can metabolic syndrome be reversed? I think this is really important because we reference it. It's everywhere. It's all around us. 60-70% of the U.S. population is dealing with metabolic syndrome. And they're wondering, can it be reversed? And we hope to address that question because it's a fair question and it's an important question to answer. But I think before we answer that question, I think it's super important that we do a quick historical recap on what is it, why is it dangerous, how's it diagnosed, and what do you need to be thinking about? Like, what is the mindset you need to have going into this if you have metabolic syndrome? So quickly, in medicine, I always say we like to name things. It's one of our favorite things to do, is to put names at things. Unfortunately, when we can't come up with a really clever name and we see a certain illness or a cluster of symptoms, we just call it a syndrome. So like fill in the blank syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is a disease process that we have identified as medicine as a cluster of conditions, when found in conjunction with each other, represent this syndrome that is due to a metabolic thing. And this metabolic thing is really the root of all metabolic disease, and we'll kind of get into that. But why is it so dangerous? And I think, simply said, metabolic disease is the single greatest variable that you can manage to have the greatest impact of your overall health and vitality and longevity. This is fueling the flames of diabetes, heart disease, cancer. Basically, it's the gateway disease to all of the diseases you don't want.
Root cause.
It really does. If you take all of the diseases that you're really most afraid of and you work backwards, it is the most significant, outside of smoking. I'm just going to assume that people who are listening to this, who care about longevity, either don't smoke or have already stopped smoking. If you're smoking, ignore everything I'm saying and just stop smoking.
Right.
Assuming we're not talking about smoking. The next most important thing you can do, no matter what you're trying to achieve, is get your head all the way around metabolic syndrome. How do you prevent it? How do you reverse it? How do you delay it? All of these things. I just think it's number one. So, Jen, go into a little bit more detail. There are actually criteria that we use on the medical side of things to diagnose metabolic syndrome. We often have suspicion, but talk to us about what the criteria are and kind of how all that works in a diagnosis.
So, as you mentioned, we're looking really for these cluster sort of symptoms or identifiers for this subgroup of individuals that are at higher risk for the chronic conditions that you mentioned, which are, diabetes, obesity,
heart disease,
abnormal lipids. So they're all geared around that, but you have to have 3 or more of each of these criteria. So one is high blood pressure or hypertension. So systolic blood pressure 130, diastolic 85 or greater. So top number 130, bottom number 85 or greater. elevated fasting.
Which, by the way, is
Yeah.
is much lower to
Uh-huh.
diagnose hypertension than most people give it credit.
Mm-hmm.
Even in our own world, we have been quite convicted recently
Yeah.
that we're not quite as aggressive as we need to be on blood pressure
Mm-hmm.
control.
Mm-hmm.
130 over 85. 9 out of 10 people walking the planet, including physicians, leave that alone.
Yeah. Well, what I will say in our defense, it's very difficult, not really difficult. It needs to be a strategic diagnosis, right? So you cannot just take one static blood pressure.
It's got to be thoughtful.
Yes.
Yes.
And there's a very
Blood pressure can go
intelligent
up
way to do it.
for any number of reasons.
Yeah. But how many times do we talk to some of our members and they get worried or concerned, which rightfully so, over one static blood pressure? And I have that conversation a lot where, hey, yes, your blood pressure is higher than normal, but let's take an average over time and really see what's going on versus like one blood pressure.
The point is it matters, and it matters a
Yeah.
lot, and the diagnostic criteria is way lower than anybody thinks.
Yes, that's right. Yep. The second one is elevated fasting blood sugar, or you'll see it on the lab sheet called glucose, and that has to be over 100. Low HDL, so less than 50 in women and less than 40 in men. So there's very strict criteria there, and that would be on your lipid panel.
Just a standard fasting lipid panel you should
When
get
you're
done.
getting that done. The same with triglycerides. So these are your blood fats, and those are typically over 150. So you'll see those elevated. And then truncal obesity, which is something that we screen our members for here as well. So waist circumference in inches greater than 35 inches in women and greater than 40 inches in men.
Yep.
So really, that's another area. You really need to be measuring it at your belly button or a little bit higher. So not down around your hips where maybe your belly is a little thinner.
No, you want to capture all the belly.
Yeah.
Actually-
it's that visceral
Yeah.
adiposity that we're really checking for. That visceral
Waistline
fat.
is a really interesting metric. You know, it is actually like if there was one thing that you could check out of all of these things with high degree of probability, it's waistline.
Yeah.
You know, as the waistline increases, all-cause mortality goes up, which is there. I don't even think smoking has that claim to fame.
Yeah.
But now it increases lots of reasons that kill you, but like everything that kills a human, your risk of it goes up as your waistline goes up.
Yeah.
And it really is around visceral fat, truncal fat, so fat in and around your organs. This is a tremendously specific marker for metabolic disease and risk for chronic diseases that kill humans. So you need 3 of those 5 criteria
Right.
at any one time, and you have diagnostic criteria met for metabolic syndrome. Great. So as we wrap up this section of the episode, like how should that make someone feel? I mean, so we have the diagnostic criteria, we understand what it is, we understand why it's important, but like what do I do about that?
Well, I think, tying into your conversation in the beginning about things being a syndrome, we typically think about this on a spectrum because it's a precursor, as you've already mentioned, to a lot of the chronic and really awful chronic diseases down the line, like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, all of those things. But we typically see this as a slow burn, right? We don't see members coming into our practice very often with full-blown diabetes that just happened yesterday. That doesn't happen. It's happened over time, and our bodies are a very fine-tuned system where these systems and processes can get out of whack pretty easily, thankfully kind of slowly. But if we don't have an offense mindset, and we've talked about offense versus defense, this particularly is a syndrome where you have to continually be on offense to fight it, because we're living in, as we've talked about on other podcasts, a very obesogenic if I can use that word,
I think so.
Environment, right? We can get meals DoorDash to us. We have fast food at our disposal. Very few people, I'm just speaking generally, eat at home anymore, or whole food diet, exercise appropriately. So those type of things, which we'll talk about later, of how to combat this, you know, you constantly have to be on offense to fight this.
Yep.
Otherwise, if you're not, things could turn for the worse, and you go down a path that you really don't want to be down.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would even take it even further and say that if you don't have an active offensive mindset to be hunting for this,
Yep.
and or reversing, just super proactive offensive, if the default, if your strategy or is just to see how it goes, or keep giving your best effort and we'll just see what happens, and more of a defensive, sit back, reactionary, the default physiology in 2023 and beyond in all developed nations is metabolic disease.
Yeah.
You will become a metabolic syndrome statistic, and you are dramatically increasing your individual risk for chronic diseases that kill humans. It is our belief and the way we practice, and it's our conviction, it's why we create this content to give it to the world. If you don't commit to having an offensive mindset to go hunting for these things and understand why they matter, metabolic disease is inevitable for most everyone.
Yeah. And I love the word you just used, strategy.
Yeah.
That is huge. Ties really nicely in with offensive mindset. That is a strategy.
Yeah. Okay. You got to call the right place.
Deploy it.
Next section of this episode is about is answering the question, can metabolic syndrome be reversed? And I think I love that question because it implies that one wants to go on offense if it is possible. And so what's the answer, Jen? Can metabolic syndrome be reversed?
Well, the good news is yes, because our bodies are this fine-tuned system, just as easily as they can get out of whack with some strategy and an offensive mindset in identifying your numbers, knowing what they are, knowing if you have 3 of the 5 risk factors and what risk factors you have, you can hone in on those and definitely reverse it. So that's the good news in all of this. And it's really just improvable for everybody. I mean, there's not any one person that I can think of that can't improve their health in some way, or one of those
Which is why we love
markers.
the word optimization.
Yeah. You can definitely optimize your blood pressure, your waistline.
You can always improve.
Your glucose, all of those things.
Especially in the things that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you alluded to it at the tail end of the first section, where all diseases, including metabolic syndrome, exist on a spectrum.
Yep.
Nobody wakes up one day with diabetes. That
No.
just doesn't happen. Your experience might be
Let's
like,
hope
oh my
not.
gosh, I went to the doctor for the first time. I was totally fine. And then I left 45 minutes with 17 medications and all of these diagnoses. Those have been going on and developing and worsening in the background for years, sometimes decades, because the default is developing these diseases.
Yeah.
And like you said, the good news is for many people, it is preventable, reversible, but because it does exist on a spectrum, it depends on where you are on the journey. So it may not be preventable and it may not be curable, but it's certainly optimizable. Everyone could stand to improve and optimize their metabolic efficiency with a very thoughtful, strategic, offensive-minded strategy. We just really believe there's nothing more significant that you could do with your health other than not smoking than to have an offensive mindset around metabolic efficiency.
Yeah.
So how do you reverse metabolic syndrome? I think in order to answer that question, Jen, explain to us what is the root physiology behind all metabolic disease?
Well, it really starts with this thing that we call insulin resistance. So if you take one thing away from this podcast, please know that it all starts with the hormone insulin, right? This is I think what you've called the holy grail of
The holy grail of health
right?
is a normalized blood sugar, which you can only achieve through optimization of your insulin response.
Yes, right. So insulin is a hormone. It is made in our pancreas, and the main job of insulin is to help our blood sugar enter our cells. So it would be our muscle cells, our fat cells, and our liver cells, where we use them for energy. We use that blood glucose for energy. And we get glucose from really two sources, mostly our food, but then our liver also makes some.
Yep.
And that's kind of a protective mechanism for times of famine, which is...
It's actually a great thing.
It's actually cool, I know.
When you go long periods of time with no food, but you
Yeah.
your blood sugar doesn't drop.
Yeah, so the liver stores it, and then it also can release it when we need it, which is pretty cool. So we ingest food, and our blood sugars can rise faster or spike higher depending on the type of food we eat. And then insulin gets released from our pancreas, and the main goal is to lower that blood sugar, bring it back down so that it normalizes. And this is a great mechanism to keep us from being perpetually diabetic, right? We don't want elevated levels of blood sugar all the time. But what happens is when we eat a diet that is not conducive to a lower blood sugar environment, that blood sugar stays consistently elevated, and we need more and more insulin to try to bring it down. So the pancreas is pumping out insulin, the blood sugar stays perpetually high, and our cells, muscle, liver, and fat cells, become kind of desensitized to insulin's role.
That's right.
So they ignore it. They ignore the signal. So what happens is the blood sugar keeps going up, the insulin keeps going up, and therefore all kinds of cascading things happen. Right. We start storing fat, we start getting symptomatic, and this is really like a precursor to prediabetes and diabetes if it's not identified and corrected.
Yeah, I mean, insulin resistance is what you're describing.
Yeah.
The state of perpetual hyperinsulinemia and hyperglucose levels creates the cascade of physiologic changes that create these diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome.
Yeah.
It causes truncal obesity. It causes hypertension, and it causes diabetes, and it causes your cholesterol numbers to go sideways, the low HDL, the high triglycerides. It causes the increased fasting glucose in the morning. So like when you're looking at those diagnostic criteria, every one of them maps back to the exact same thing, which is you have over too much time, you have too much blood sugar, which means you're exposed to too much insulin, which means your tissues are not responding to the insulin, which is insulin resistance. And eventually you become diabetic. Diabetes is just poorly controlled insulin resistance. It's a spectrum.
So the term that you used while we were preparing for this, which I love, is it's fanning the flames, right? It's like the spark is the metabolic syndrome.
Yes.
The flame gets, stronger and stronger with insulin resistance, and that just cascades into something.
Yeah, and you think about the
horrible.
diseases that we're so scared about, like cancer and heart disease. Well, diabetes, which is just poorly controlled insulin resistance, is a cardiac risk equivalent to having known heart disease.
Yeah.
It is the number, other than smoking, it's the number one contributor to heart disease.
It's also horrible for your kidneys.
It's not the only thing that causes heart disease.
Yeah.
But if you have diabetes, you will have cardiac issues. The end.
The end. That's pretty scary.
Cancer cells, tumors, these are uncontrolled cell growth. It is tumors are cells dividing without the signal to divide. They are growing out of control when your body is not giving it to the sign. This is a high energy consumption. What do we think cancer cells consume? Glucose.
Yeah.
Sugar.
Sugar.
There's no other fuel source for a cancer cell.
Somebody I know called it cancer food. Sugar's cancer food.
Yeah.
I'm like,
no,
ooh.
this is what we mean when we say insulin resistance is fanning the flames of downstream end-stage metabolic disease like cancer and heart disease. This is massively significant.
Yeah, that's why we take it so seriously.
And taking a passive, reactionary approach to this means you will be one of the 60 to 70% of all adults who end up on a statin for cholesterol, a blood pressure medicine for blood pressure, like always looking to lower your waistline. Like you have all the same diseases.
So, not to digress, but you may also end up on insulin, which, by the way, will make you gain weight.
Yeah. which, and the answer is always more insulin.
Yeah.
Which controls your blood sugar and makes you feel good in the short term, but long term, it actually hastens the very problem, which is this hyperinsulinemic state.
Yeah.
This is why all diabetics just get worse.
Yeah.
It's a very slippery slope, and the only play is offense. And so then you would say, well, what is the offense? And we believe, kind of as a continuation over the last 3 months of content we've been creating, that we believe that all meaningful progress in one's health journey typically come from either optimizing from one of 3 pillars. The first pillar is what we call how you feed your body, so your diet. Is there an opportunity to optimize the way you feed your body? Is there pillar number 2 is how do you move your body, your fitness plan? What is your activity like? What is your strategy for moving through space while you're alive? And the third pillar is how do you recover your body? So how do you eat? How do you move? How do you recover? We believe all meaningful progress falls into one of those 3 buckets most of the time.
Yeah.
So with that framework, an offensive mindset towards metabolic syndrome would be diet. As a general rule, we think for most people adopting a fasted lifestyle makes the most sense, and it is the greatest return on your investment. Some people may fast for 12 hours a day, some people 16, 18, some people do 24 hours a day, some people like long fast. I have no idea. The idea here is find out what fasting is, what works for you, what's practical, what's sustainable, and adopt a lifestyle of eating less often.
And historically, what we have seen in our members who come in with lipid panels that are disaster, when they start fasting, those numbers turn around really quickly.
Very fast.
Our cadence is usually to recheck them about in 90 days, and we generally
It's rare to not see improvement.
A marked improvement in those numbers.
That's correct.
So that's 2 criteria you can take off the list for metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, and not to mention create some momentum.
Yeah.
When you do open your mouth and you are going to eat, we believe that I don't really care what dietary thesis you want to subscribe to, just eat whole foods. If it wasn't food 100 years ago, it isn't food.
Right.
Like, get rid of processed foods. Make it real food. Close your feeding window as tight as possible that's sustainable and repeatable, and that will get you 80%, 85% of the way there from the diet bucket.
Yep.
Fitness. The holy grail here is maximize lean mass. Your skeletal muscle. As a human, you're built on the back of your muscles and bones.
Yep.
Your muscles are your sugar burners. That's where your insulin sensitivity response is going to be. The more lean mass you have, the easier it is going to be to maintain an optimal blood glucose and insulin sensitivity. That implies that you need to be doing some strength training.
Yep.
You need strong muscles. You need as much as possible. So strength training, even for women, and even for our more senior members, finding a way to move your body against resistance is absolutely fundamentally critical.
Yes.
We like, again, for most people, to do an early morning workout where you're fasted, where you go into this, you're already not in a fed state. So you've already kind of optimized your biochemistry. Take that biochemistry, fasted biochemistry, into some strength training and movement, prolong your fast and put a little mechanical stress. It really has tremendous benefit. And what we don't push enough, but there's great data, is a post-dinner walk. Eat supper at 5 or 6. Give yourself an hour or 2. Go for a 30-minute walk. There's great data to say that this is excellent for insulin sensitivity and glycemic control, not to mention peace of mind. Stress relief. You sliding into your restful hours in a very, very depleted state, which is ideal. And then lastly, sleep. we have been talking a lot about sleep in terms of recovery. We currently believe that it is more important than diet and exercise. I mean, it just is the single greatest area of opportunity. It happens to be the most elusive to high achieving, our type of clientele, kind of across the board. You live a life where there's a lot on the line.
Yeah.
And it's hard to turn that off, and sleep can become very, very elusive. And we just do all of our recovering while we're sleeping.
Yeah.
And so we bring some of yesterday's fatigue into today, and that's unfair, and that starts stacking. We believe that some really great, simple things you can do would be, number one, make it a priority.
Yeah.
Stop poo-pooing sleep as being important. That's foolish, it's deluded thinking, and it's not true.
Yeah.
It's the most important thing. So you make it a priority, and then start tracking your data.
There's some great tools out there.
Whoop, Oura Ring, big fans. What you're going to find is when you start tracking your data, you'll start looking at the data, and you will, without even realizing it, begin to change and modify your behavior so that you get better scores.
Yeah.
And that is very easy. And those are the things that we believe could be very easy to apply, offensive-minded kind of tactics.
One thing we talk about is you can't manage what you don't measure, right?
You cannot.
So got to measure it.
Yeah, your best hope in that situation is you're guessing.
Yeah.
And hope is a wonderful thing, but it's not a strategy.
No.
Okay, the last section, and we're going to wrap up here. And this is this gets a little more heady. This third section, this is the effect insulin resistance. Like understanding the effect of insulin resistance on metabolic syndrome, how that can affect you and impact you psychologically. I think too often the psychological, spiritual, emotional journey of being a human doesn't get talked about enough from healthcare providers. I like to think we talk about it a lot in an appropriate amount. And this is no different. I think most people who have metabolic syndrome struggle with weight. They struggle to understand what the heck is going on with their blood pressure, why we can't lose weight, why are my blood sugars going crazy, why are my cholesterols going... It seems totally random, and nobody seems to have any answers, and I don't know what to do. I really want to stress this point that when you become... when the main thing becomes clear to something that's significant. I'm not talking about majoring in minor things. I'm talking about a massively important thing like metabolic syndrome. When all of a sudden you have this light bulb moment that this really comes down to my body's relationship with insulin, and that if all of my effort and energy and creativity and resourcefulness and focus is on optimizing my body's relationship with insulin, and then you see significant movement in metrics that matter, it's a psychological shift where there it is. It's a momentum builder. It obliterates the overwhelm and the complexity, and that simplicity and that clarity gives you a lot of momentum. And we talk a lot about multipliers. If I could wish one thing, it would be that people understood that the primary enemy of 2023 and beyond for humans is insulin. Juxtaposed to the fact that it's necessary for life.
Right.
But we live in a world of abundance. You alluded to this. It's never been easier to get a cheesecake and cookies dropped off at your doorstep in 1 hour. The luxuries and finer surpluses in life are at our fingertip, and they're immediately available, and they're available at surplus. You will never win that battle. It's a setup for failure if you are not on offense.
Yeah, if you constantly give into that.
Yeah, and if you take a passive approach to your health, you're going to lose. Long term, eventually you will pay the consequences. What do we say? Easy life now, hard life later.
That's right.
Hard life now, easy life later. Implementing discipline around this area can potentially free you down the road of the things that you want to be free from the most, like cancer, heart attack, those things. And that's why we create this. I think as we were preparing for this and kind of wrapping up, Jen, you really nailed kind of 4 big take-home points.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share those?
Well, the first thing is, I think we've quoted this before on the podcast, but all meaningful progress starts with telling the truth.
Yeah.
And so another way of spinning that for this podcast is knowing the truth. So get your numbers checked, know what they are. That has to be the next first step, is to definitely know where you fall on the spectrum, right?
Let's be honest about where we're at. Let's know our numbers.
Yep.
What else?
The next one is find your team, find a provider that takes this as seriously as you should and want to, and doesn't just say, oh, well, you don't need to worry about that right now because you're 35 and
Keep
you have plenty of time to turn it around.
If it gets worse, we'll do something.
Yeah.
What is
yeah.
that?
Yeah. It's like, no. Let's go on offense early.
Find a provider
go
that
on offense early.
is aligned with you.
Yeah.
In your values and your goals.
Yeah.
And that can support you on being on offense.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't agree more with finding your team.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that again,
Yep.
tons.
Yep. And then to reiterate again is go on offense. Just don't bury your head in the sand. Don't, get into the gap, as we've talked about the gap in the gain before, of where you are coming from or maybe your past. It's like you have the power and the knowledge, and if you have a great team, to really turn this around for yourself and prevent major chronic diseases from happening, and to live a long, healthy, vibrant life. Who doesn't want that?
Yeah, and even if you can't prevent, you delay.
Yeah, delay.
And the name of the game is live as long as possible, as healthy as possible. And so, and people who take a sit back, we'll see how it goes, passive approach, reactionary approach, it is very unlikely that they're going to win.
Yeah.
The game of, I lived a long time and was super, super healthy. Because the default, all of the forces through mass agriculture, through pop culture, through marketing, and the current sick care model are all pushing you towards disease, but don't die.
Yeah.
And we are kind of the opposite of that.
Right. Absolutely.
So this has been good.
Very good.
I always enjoy our time together. I hope this episode, if it lands on one person and they're able to take a meaningful step to a better future self, then it's worth the effort that we put into this. Please feel free to share, comment, let us know what you think, what you'd like to hear more of. And until we meet again. Jen, any famous last words?
I'm going to steal a Wenzelism. Insulin is the devil. Ooh, that's a good one. Put that on a t-shirt.
Thanks, Jen. We'll see you next time.
Bye.